Okay, let's talk government spending and taxation. All right, so taxes are obviously at the heart of economic discussion. Even by this little cartoon, I love this little cartoon. You can't get blood from a stone, right? There's only two things, or the other cliche. There's only two things in life you actually have to do. Death and pay taxes, right? Nobody likes to pay taxes, and so it's often at the forefront of political economic discussion. So let's take a closer look. So first of all, I like to start with, well, why taxes, right? Why is it that we have so many taxes? And the reality is because of this. Now, feel free to pause this and look more carefully at this pie chart. And this pie chart is always changing, but generally these are the trends, right? The things that we kind of benefit from, the things that we benefit from, that we all benefit from, or that we benefit from when we're elderly or from when we're sick or whatever the case is where our taxes go. Taxes are as old as history itself. And that's not a cliche. That I literally mean that, right? When we look at and go back to ancient history and we talk about our first governments, taxes existed, right? For the sake of public works or whatever else, the government at the time deemed important for all of its people. Okay, now with that in mind, realize that has become particularly an issue in the United States as our federal debt continues to climb because our expenses don't seem to match the amount we're paying in taxes. And so you can see here, right, this is actually now ends in 2015, but you can see kind of the way in which over the past 40 years, our debt has grown. There's actually this little debt clock. Let me just take you out to it. I'll show you real fast. This debt clock that regularly counts all the portion of our debt. And you can see here how it's moving even as we sit here, right? $33,707 trillion. Okay. And this is growing at a rate that we can't seem to maintain, right? The idea is that our GDP is not moving at the same rate as our debt. It's kind of like if you had a job and you had a salary and you also had credit card debt, and your credit card debt was growing at a rate much higher, much faster than your salary was growing. You'd be in trouble. And so people worry about what this means for the future of our country. And the reality is that even though we know this is an issue, you can see here every year when our Congress and our president put together a budget, we seem to be carrying all of these deficits. We keep passing budgets that are encouraging us to go into more debt. That's a budget deficit versus a budget surplus. We haven't had any kind of surplus since all the way back, in the early 2000s. Okay. Obviously, this was also made worse by the Great Recession. Here you can see, and also, of course, look at the COVID pandemic, right? And so these things have not helped the cause. If you've been paying attention at all to politics, this has come to a head several times among our representatives in Congress over this debt ceiling. Keep in mind that this debt ceiling and kind of raising the debt limit has become a common solution to this problem. And even though there is a lot of fighting that's gone on about this, it really seems to be a problem of all of our administrations, right? We keep kind of raising the debt. And what does that mean for us as individuals? It means that there doesn't seem, as of right now, to be an end in sight, right? Look at this, projected. Okay, so here we are somewhere right around here, okay, and it's projected to go up more and more. Okay, with that bad news kind of out there now, let's take a closer look at what it is that goes on behind the scenes in this budget process and what are some of the important vocabulary involved in taxes, and then why it is essentially that the government keeps running these budget deficits even though we know we're going into more debt. Okay, so we're going to call this the budget process, taxes, and then eventually this is going to lead to your fiscal policy. So if you've already done the tutorials and the readings on fiscal policy, great. You have a lot of context here. If you haven't, that's what you should do next. Okay, so let's start with government expenses. So some of the terminology used in this is mandatory and discretionary. So realize that there are certain laws that are passed in Congress that require the government to spend a certain amount of money. Like if they didn't do it, they would be breaking the law, right? As an example, entitlements. So entitlements, as its name indicates, are those things that US citizens are entitled to by law. So, for instance, you might have grandparents that collect Social Security. So they've worked all their life, they've paid into Social Security, and now they're collecting Social Security. This was part of New Deal legislation as a retirement security for older Americans. Okay, so that would be a good example of an entitlement. If I were to really quickly, I don't want to drag this out, but if I were to really quickly go back to this pie chart, right? Social Security is the biggest piece of the pie here. Okay, and it continues to be. And as Americans and as life expectancy gets longer and longer and longer, the fact is that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. Also, that debt, we just looked at that $33 trillion. Well, even though you may carry a debt and you might have time, let's hope, right, to pay it back, there is certain interest you have to pay on that debt. So if I were to go back to this clock here for a second, right, you can see, right, all these numbers that are, jumping. Look at the right here. This is the interest on the debt. So this has to be paid, right? This has to. So here's Social Security, right? Here's the interest. So it's a big amount of money, okay? And then of course the operating budget, right? The government's got to pay its bills like the rest of us. They've got to heat the Capitol. They've got to pay for the electricity in the White House. So there are certain things that they just have to pay as a matter of kind of everyday life. Now, what does that mean? When the president and Congress organize the budget, which is how the process works, the president puts together a plan, the House of Representatives puts together a plan, the Senate puts together a plan, and then ultimately they all come together to kind of hash it out, right? Make some deals, make some compromises, and then hopefully, right, it passes through the House, it passes through the Senate, and then the president approves it, okay? And so what is all the debate? What's all the fighting about, right? That's not about the mandatory, because they've got to pay that. It's about the discretionary. It's the should we or shouldn't we? Right? It's the capital budget. So as an example, infrastructure, right? There's a lot of talk about, and there was an infrastructure bill passed recently about the highways and updating, you know, the rail system in our country that's now becoming increasingly antiquated. So what do we do about that? Of course, defense spending, right? So we've seen a lot of this in the news lately about the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East. How much do we send? Should we or shouldn't we? Okay. Education, even though education is a reserved power, right? Even though it's a power that's reserved to the states, the federal government has at various times made a push to kind of have its influence felt in education. Well, the only way they can actually do that is by saying, well, we're going to give you money. And if you take our money, then you have to kind of abide by some of these policies. That's the way it works with the federalist system. Okay. And also tax incentives, right? When the government will say, well, we'll give a tax credit here, or we'll give a tax exemption here. You may have heard this expression when people are filing their taxes at the end of the year, right? Because the government wants to encourage certain behaviors. And so when they incentivize this, they might exclude somebody from paying a tax on something, or they might actually give a credit back to somebody. And so these are the things that are regularly debated towards working a balanced budget, which, as we said, is normally not the result. Normally, the result is the budget deficit. Okay, hence, cartoons like this, right? Here we go. Here's a $1.2 trillion deficit, right, of the budget for the year that's just tacked on to the national debt, which is that $33 trillion. So this is constantly in the discussion. Now, the other piece of the puzzle is you should know where taxes come from. Okay, this is what we call the tax base. It's the areas that are subject to taxation. So as you know, if any of you have a job and you get a paycheck, you know that the money that you're being paid per hour is not actually what you're taking home, right? The money you're being paid per hour, some of it is taken out in taxes. Okay, so anybody who is working, who is part of the system of, I'm not talking about like an off the books. We can talk about that separately. That actually is not allowed. Okay, there are certain types of jobs where you don't pay your taxes up front. You have to pay it at the end of the year. That's okay. Okay, but if you're working, you're supposed to be paying an income tax. And that might be an income tax to a city, right? Like if you're working in New York City, it might be an income tax to the state, New York State, and to the federal government, or it might be all three of these things, right? Depends. Okay, so income tax is a very Probably the most obvious one that people talk about. There's also, of course, sales tax. Now that varies state by state. Like you go to New Jersey and you don't pay the same taxes on clothes there that you pay in New York. Or even if you go into New York City, you're going to pay a higher tax than you do maybe in Rockland County because of the various local city rules. Okay, and so when you purchase something, there's Uncle Sam normally gets a little bit of a piece of it. Okay. By the way, I just want to point out this is why when the economy is doing well and people are out there and buying, this is good for government, right? Because these sales are generating taxes, which by the way, the same way for unemployment, right? When people are unemployed, that's not just an individual and their family missing out on a salary. That's a government missing out on the tax on that salary. Okay. So all of these things are in the best interest of government. There's also property taxes. Property taxes are local, right? Property taxes, I'm sure you've heard about school taxes also, right? So property taxes and school taxes are connected. That would be something very local, like Orangetown would be responsible for that, okay? And then, of course, there's income taxes. We talked a little bit about the incorporation of business, right? This idea that businesses, when they incorporate, they are protected, that they have a limited liability. But what that also means is that they are an entity that has to pay taxes. This is something that will be, this is a tax that taxes profits. This is, of course, a very common debate because you don't want to scare businesses off. You want to keep businesses in this country. You don't want them to go to other places that have very low income tax. So to what extent is it the benefit for the United States to have a higher corporate tax, right? This is constantly being debated in political circles, okay? Now, what about tax structure? So tax structure is the last piece of the puzzle here, and I'm watching the time because the bell's gonna ring on me. So tax structure refers to the way in which taxes are organized, okay? So these terms here, progressive, proportional, regressive, right? You can see them here in this little diagram. Let me take you to this second slide because I think this actually provides a better look. So let's start with the proportional tax. So a proportional tax would be everybody pays the same amount. So that's like a sales tax, right? So whether I'm eating at, the local restaurant or, Elon Musk is eating at the local restaurant, we're both paying the same percentage on our meal, right? What that sometimes will mean to people, okay, it's all often about like an interpretation too, is that tax is almost like a regressive tax, meaning that, Elon Musk makes a lot more money than me. And so I'm actually paying a bigger percentage of my income towards that proportional tax than is Elon Musk. Hence why in the early 20th century, the 16th Amendment was passed to make income tax progressive, meaning that as you make more money, not only are you paying more in flat dollar amounts, as if it were a proportional tax, but the actual percentage of what you pay goes up. Okay, this is what we talk about when you hear about tax brackets, right? The more money you make, the higher the percentage you pay. Okay, and so this is kind of at the heart of that income tax discussion. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, right? Keep in mind there's a lot of vocabulary here. Okay, so the structure of taxes, the tax base, right? This idea of discretionary spending versus mandatory spending, this idea of budget deficit and surplus, and the budget process versus the national debt, okay? And then, of course, bringing us back to the top, kind of the reason for taxes to begin with. Okay, that's it. On to the next one.